Welcome. I'm Carol Head, the president of the Solve M.E. CFS initiative, and I'm so happy that you're able to join us today for the Gold Circle conversation. Just a quick summary here. We're going to hear about our research program and about our advocacy program.
So our research program today is going to feature information on the Ramsey program as well as our registry, You and Me.
And I'm Emily, I'm the Director of Advocacy and Community Relations, and I talk about the outcome of the midterm elections, what they mean for ME/CFS, and for the policy wonks out there, I get way into the weeds on what the difference between a task force and an interagency working group is.
So, thank you so much for listening. We hope we find it compelling. Please don't ever forget that we cannot do any of our work without you all, and through the end of November, we do have a triple match for any gifts that you choose to give. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our Gold Circle conversation. We're so glad you could be here. My name is Carolyn Mayo and I'm the Director of Development for the Solve M.E. CFS initiative. This is an interactive conversation and we want you to participate. So here's how. You'll see a hand icon with a green arrow on your computer. Please click it if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question. And Diana, our moderator, will alert you when it's your turn to ask your question. In the meantime, please mute your phone. It'll work best for sound quality, but please remember to take it off of mute when it's your turn to ask your question. I also wanted to let you know that we're recording this session to share. So thanks again for joining us. And now I am pleased to introduce you to SMCI President Carol Head.
Well, thank you to all of you who are joining us on this last Gold Circle conversation of the year. I'm delighted that we have this opportunity to talk with you. We are going to first present information about our research program led by Dr. Sadie Whittaker, and then information about our advocacy program led by Director of Advocacy Emily Taylor. And that's really the substance of what we're doing. And then we want to make sure to leave time at the end for questions. So please do write down your questions as we go through this, and we look forward to hearing what's on your mind. So I think with that, I will hand this off to Dr. Sadie Whittaker. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am excited to be here to present our Science and Discovery Strategic Plan. This really outlines my vision for what we can do in science and discovery and how we can capitalize on some existing programs, enhance others, and really work towards advancing our research program towards a cure. So the first slide that I have is really an overview of our goals and objectives. So there are two pillars. On the left, develop a research infrastructure to facilitate discovery. Within that, we have our Ramsey program, which many of you are familiar with, the goal being to attract new researchers to the field and ensure that they feel supported and engaged. So we want to get them in, keep them in, and encourage them to apply for bigger and bigger grants to grow our pool of researchers working in this field. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. The second pillar is our patient registry and biobank. This is going to be a global registry that can help accelerate discovery, and I'm going to talk in detail about that coming up. Last, we want to retain and engage a diverse research advisory council. We're lucky enough to have a number of individuals from the research community who've agreed to sit on our advisory committee, and we hope to deepen our engagement with them in the coming months and years. So on the other side of the strategic plan is communicate and collaborate to advance progress. So we want to ensure clinicians are aware of this disease. We want to leverage every activity that we do in research to raise disease awareness and to meet our advocacy goals. And you'll see some of that coming through as we talk about some of our programmatic elements. And last, we want to collaborate with the CRCs and other working groups so that we're integrated into the ME/CFS research community. So importantly, if you look at the bottom of this slide, we really thought a little bit about what the key themes that underlie everything that we do. and they're listed out here. So I'm sure if you've heard me speak before, you'll know I'm a big fan of collaboration. We want to collaborate effectively with all members of the healthcare community touching this disease. We want to meaningfully integrate patients, and you'll start to see some of how we're doing that on our registry coming up. And then on the communication side, we really want to be able to communicate research findings in a simple, contextualized way. So if a new piece of research emerges, we want to make it really clear and easy for people to understand what this research means and how it fits into the larger understanding of the disease. So our research portfolio is expansive. You'll see on this very pretty slide that Alison made for me. It touches all of the key areas that are thought to be important in this disease. So you'll see in the red text, these are our Ramsey awardees. The green text, these are projects which are directed by SMCI. We have our registry and biobank highlighted here on the kind of the 6 p.m. part of the dial. And then we have a patient-initiated project. This was a specific project that a patient wanted to support, and we were able to facilitate that through our research organization. So I'm going to talk more in more detail about these specific research projects, but I wanted to give you a kind of a high-level understanding of what areas our research portfolio touches on. So the first section I'm going to talk about is our registry, which we're calling You and Me. So if you see the slide with the 5 pillars, are we on the right slide? Yeah, okay. We're really seeing the registry as a resource that can be used by the entire community. So we have a number of pillars that we wanted to incorporate into our registry. The first was, I really felt strongly that it wasn't adequate to capture data on patient symptoms once a year. And so we have done a fair amount of investigation into how we can do ongoing data collection. And we're going to integrate an app that will allow us to capture data on an ongoing basis. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. We are going to use the peer platform for baseline data collection. And then regarding collection of biosamples, we are going to facilitate at-home blood sample collection for severe patients. And we are in talks with Lyft about how we might integrate their service into facilitating patients being able to get free rides to places to give a blood sample. In phase 2, we're hoping to look at how to integrate into electronic health records. That's no mean feat. So it's certainly something that we would want to look at in phase 2, but we feel like it could be an important component in tying together both patient-reported outcomes as well as clinical data. We'd like to integrate wearables. We'd also like to integrate Alexa. We think voice-activated approaches to submit your data to the registry are going to be really important, particularly for the severe patients. And then we'd like to have a caregiver arm to the registry. Caregivers obviously spend a significant amount of time with their loved ones and have a lot of information, and so we'd like to capitalize on that. A second fundamental aspect is that we want the registry to be global, centralized, and standardized. So we're going to promote the use of common data elements, establish standard procedures for sample collection, and then importantly, wherever we can, we're going to try and integrate siloed data repositories. So I've had some initial conversations with Louise Nasul at the London School into how we can do that with the data that they have. But the goal here is really, how do you get to the largest possible data set that will now allow researchers to be able to look for trends and subtypes. The third pillar is we want the data to be accessible. So we want researchers to be able to easily understand what is in the data set and how they might be able to use it. We want the process to access the samples to be nimble, and we want the samples to be only used for quality research. And I'll talk a little bit more about that process coming up. The fourth pillar, patients are meaningfully integrated. So we want the data that's collected to be important to patients, so data that they feel is meaningful. We want the process to be easy. We want to share the data back with the patients. We want the data to only be used in research that is meaningful to patients. And we want to incorporate a participatory design process. And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, this is where anybody who participates in the registry is able to submit a research question or questions that will then be voted on, and whichever suggestions receive the most number of votes, we will take forward as a research avenue. Last, we want to leverage the registry to build disease awareness. So this is something that is potentially interesting to healthcare providers, and so we really want to leverage the fact that we have this registry to reach out and begin to do physician education and increase awareness. So the next slide. This is how we've started to engage with the community to build this resource. So on the left-hand side, the pillar on the left, we've been using human design methodologies to work with the patient community to understand what symptoms are meaningful to them, how often they want to capture those symptoms, how they want to see the data, and what method they want to use to capture the data. So we've done this through online surveys as well as one-on-one conversations with individuals across the severity spectrum. And I'll show you some of those results on the next slide. The middle pillar, we've really been talking to the experts. So I mentioned conversations with Louise Nassul. We've also been speaking with Len Jason, who obviously has a lot of expertise in the development of patient instruments. Dan Archer, who's on our research advisory committee, is an informaticist technology guru, and he's been really helpful when we start to think about how these data sets can be consolidated. And then Chris Armstrong has been our partner throughout this process. Some of you may know that he's been developing an app to measure symptoms in chronic disease, and we're going to be integrating his app into our registry. Last, we've been talking to clinicians and researchers, been sharing our plans. Does this data capture process look okay to you? How would you want to access the data? What would be meaningful to you? And then we've been speaking to clinicians about how could we facilitate patient recruitment, both among the patients they see, but in the broader patient community. So we're currently in this right-hand side last pillar. We've talked to some clinicians and researchers, but that's kind of where we're at in the process right now. So I mentioned that we had surveyed patients. These are some of the results that we got back. So we asked them, if you were going to report symptoms on an ongoing basis, what would those symptoms be? And these were the 5 that bubbled up to the top. So fatigue, post-exertional malaise, orthostatic intolerance, cognitive impairment, and unrefreshing sleep. Frequency, there was about 50% said weekly, 30% said daily. And then what method of entering data for an ongoing basis was preferable? 60% a mobile app and 40% computer-based. So where we've kind of landed based on these survey results is that we are going to use a Chris Armstrong's, as I mentioned, also has a computer-based interface. So we think that that is going to meet those needs. And then in terms of frequency, we're looking at an every 3-day data capture, because we want to be able to track things like post-exertional malaise, what they think the onset was, how long it lasted, and we think that weekly may be too far a frequency to be able to capture that. So we also asked what would keep patients motivated to continuing entering data, and you'll see some of the results on the right-hand side there. So trends, right, reporting back the data, ability to do a report to provide my clinicians, and learning from other patients. And so we're integrating all of these into the app. So you will be able to, as you capture data on an ongoing basis, you will be able to share this with your clinicians but capture it between visits and then take it to your visit, so they'll really be able to understand how your symptoms have been affecting you between visits. There will be a community aspect, so you will be able to see how other patients are doing. And then we will be sharing back any of the research results and trends that are identified as a result of data from the registry. So this next slide just talks about our process. So if you sign up to be part of our registry, you will go onto the peer platform, which is an online database, and enter some very detailed information about your medical history, demographics, and you'll complete some key instruments. Then if you look at the top, the little green lines that are running along the top, you will, after you've completed that peer platform data, you'll then get a link to the app, and you'll be able to enter data on an ongoing basis on those 5 symptoms that I mentioned. You will also be able to do whatever other tracking and other symptom capture that you want to do for your own benefit. The app has that capacity. And then every 12 months, we will just add to our baseline data by asking you to complete the DSQ and asking you if your medications have changed over the previous 12 months. So this next slide shows you how the data will be integrated. So on the top in orange, you'll see the computer there represents that big data dump that you will do at the start of the study. And the green mobile phone icon at the bottom of the slide is representative of data entered via the app. So you'll end up with two data pools that will then get integrated into a single data set. And then in terms of how researchers will access this, there will be two methods. So a researcher can apply to us to become a vetted individual or a vetted organization, or we'll accept individual proposals for specific research. There'll be a review panel that will include patients as well as clinicians and researchers who will vet those applications, either to become a kind of accredited individual or a proposal. And once you're approved, then you'll be able to access the data sets that are in the registry. So I mentioned earlier that one of my goals is to see how we can aggregate these disparate data sets from around the world. I talked a little bit already about initial conversations with Louise Massour. This just lists some of the other registries around the world that we hope to follow upon and begin to kind of bring on board. Our goal is to, again, see if we can really build the biggest possible data set available, because I truly believe that once we have a big enough data set, it will be much clearer for researchers to be able to understand what's going on. I mentioned earlier that one of the goals of the research organisation is that we want to leverage the registry to do disease education among clinicians. And this is a specific example of how we're hoping to do this with the registry. So we'd like to partner with a closed healthcare system, for example, Kaiser or Cedars, which is a big hospital here in LA, which has is a closed system, to run a pilot to help us identify patients for the registry and biobank. Our assumption is that going into these organizations, there will be a gap in their knowledge or in their physician's knowledge about this disease. And so we'd like to implement a physician patients for the registry. So it could take the form of a webinar or lunch and learns. We'd like to develop a pocket-sized version of the diagnostic criteria that they could keep in their lab coat pocket. And then we want to build some metrics in so that we can measure success and enable us to scale this idea to other healthcare systems. So this is the last slide of the registry. I talked a little bit about what we'd like to do for phase 2, including the wearables, Alexa, and electronic health records. The other thing we'd really like to do once we have a big enough data set is create some data visualizations that we can use in communication to help people understand the symptom burden that patients have, and some statistics about the disease that can be used to increase understanding about what's going on with patients in this disease. So really using the data set to communicate about the significant burden. So that's the registry. Next, I'll move on to our Ramsey Award program. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our Ramsey Award program is really designed to bring new researchers into this field, to keep them engaged, to allow them to generate data that will facilitate them applying for larger grant dollars from their government organizations or from foundations, for example, the NIH. And this is a great program, and it's already begun to show some results. So we started in 2016. You'll see we had Jared Younger, Bhupesh Prusti, Fane Mensah, and Carmen Scheibenbogen, who were our initial class. Out of that set, a significant number have already published data, and some of you may know that Jared has recently applied for a large NIH grant to continue his work. Fane Mensah, who is out of University College in London, we have just provided with some follow-up funding to continue his work in partnership with Louise Nassau at the London School, leveraging their data set to extend his work. The 2017 class, Carmen Scheibenbogen, Lubov Nathanson, Fiona Newberry, Erin Siegel, and Jonas Blomberg. And then our 2018 class that was recently announced, we provided additional funding to Jonas Blomberg to extend his work. And then we had some new researchers in this field, Liz Worthy, Harris Theoharid, and I'm sorry for butchering that name, and Vince Lombardi. Some of you may have been in DC when Liz Worthy presented her project, but that's a particularly interesting study in that they're analysing, they're doing whole genome sequencing of patients and healthy controls using some of Jared Younger's data. So Liz is also based in Huntsville alongside Jared, and he was actually the one who brought Liz into the field. So we're particularly excited about Liz's work in that it will hopefully be able to have results quickly, and we think that the results are going to be fairly impactful in looking at genetic differences between patients and healthy controls. So this next slide talks about some of the things that we have integrated to enhance this program. I think it's a great program, was initiated before I started, but I think we have the ability to do a lot more with it, and we've already started to integrate some of those approaches. So if you look at the bottom of this slide, the foundational aspects, obviously we'll continue to fund researchers and keep them engaged. We'd like to expand the program in 19 and beyond to be able to fund more researchers, and we're also going to slightly tweak our RFP language so that there's an increased focus on collaboration, particularly with these smaller grants. I think there's a potential to get more data faster with collaborations. The middle part of this slide, so the middle stripe, is some approaches that we have adopted to enhance the program. So on the left, we want to strengthen our communication approaches for awareness building, advocacy, and development. So we have already started to integrate the researchers more into our Gold Circle events. We want to share more frequent updates to the community. And we've also built an advocacy action into the paperwork for our scholars. So this is based on the insight that policymakers are more receptive to researchers when it comes to taking action towards a disease. For example, committing additional resources and funding opportunities for a disease. So we actually built this into the agreement. Any Ramsey scholar who accepts the dollars from us has to take an advocacy action. And this, we give them a number of options, but it could be they could write a letter to a policymaker. They could write a newsletter, they could do an open letter to their university president, they could meet with a policymaker. So we provided them with a number of options, but the goal is that they will use their research to build support for this disease. In the middle part of this middle stripe, we improved the granting process. So we integrated patient reviewers for the first time ever. We also double-blinded the review and strengthened our policies. And then last, I mentioned a goal of the Ramsey program is to enable researchers to obtain larger grants. We've never been as proactive as we hope to be going forward, and so we'd really like to encourage this more. So what that means is we'll identify proposals that might be suitable to get a larger grant. We'll identify RFAs and submit them to our Ramsey scholars. We'll help them write the actual proposals, or we'll pair them with researchers who've written R01s before and create a mentorship so that they actually know how to get these bigger grants. The top of this slide is some things that we're going to do to innovate. So we want to bring more new researchers into the field. And previously we've been reactive in doing this. Whoever applies for a Ramsey grant will be considered, but we want to be more proactive. So in 2019 and beyond, we're going to start to identify researchers who may be doing research in a related field and try and encourage them to submit for a Ramsey program. We want to increase collaboration among our Ramsey researchers as well as data sharing. So we're going to set up a Slack channel. We'd like to set up a secure online hub where people can share unpublished data. We'd like to host a biannual call as well as an annual event where they can share research findings. A goal is to not only attract researchers, but to keep them in the field. And to do that, we want them to have access to mentorship and support. And so we are going to make our Research Advisory Council members available to anyone who is interested in either a very specific question that they might have as they are doing their research, or for ongoing mentorship. And then last, to meet our goal of communicating more broadly to the community about the results of our Ramsey program, we're going to launch the Ramsey Research Reporter, which will be a supplement that summarizes and contextualizes some of the findings from that program. We don't need to talk through this. This is what I mentioned before about the visibility action. It just talks about the specific language that's in our contracting. So next is our Research Advisory Council. I've mentioned them a couple of times through this presentation, but I wanted to just remind everybody of the people that are sat on this group. We're very, very lucky that everybody here has agreed to be a resource for us, and I've already used them extensively since I've been on board. Our goal for this, for 2019 and beyond, is to grow the ranks and to include some people who maybe are not experts in ME/CFS but have relevant expertise from outside the field, so that we can have a little bit more of a diverse group. Another goal is that we'd like to more deeply integrate this group into all of our work and increase the amount of engagement that each of these people has in achieving our objectives. I mentioned on the first slide about some of our external collaborations, but as part of our integration with the NIH CRCs, we are participating in the groups listed here. So the two DMCC groups, the Community Working Group and the Data Collection Working Group. And then we're on the Columbia CRC Patient Ad Board. We are partnering with the mHealth app development. And what we're hoping to do there is really capitalize on all of the learnings that we currently have, that we've collected as part of our registry development, to see if maybe we could all use the same app. I think it's been a frustration in the past of mine when people have developed kind of similar platforms to do the same job, and you end up with all these disparate data sets. So we're in talks with Tony Komaroff about how we might integrate and be aligned on that app. And then last, we're on the Cornell CRC Patient Advisory Board. Many of you know that CFSAC disbanded, but we are continuing to participate in their clinical trials subgroup, even though it's not under the CFSAC remit anymore. So excited to be advancing that work. Okay, physician education. So we're starting to dip our toe into this a little bit more. I mentioned that we're leveraging some of our activities to raise awareness, for example, the registry. But this is kind of another area where we're going to create some materials aimed at accelerating clinician disease awareness. So we're going to develop or leverage existing. So we're kind of going to do a landscape assessment of what's already out there and develop materials where there are gaps. But we're calling it ME CFS 101. And we're going to feature that material on our website. But in addition, we're going to package those materials and do proactive outreach to medical education providers, medical schools, and medical societies. And see if we can develop some relationships where they'll start to feature these materials in their educational outreach or on their websites. Last, we want to provide an incentive for physicians to ME CFS certify themselves, and we would list those centres on our website if they completed, say, a short training that we would host on our website. I'm going to close it out by just outlining a couple of big ideas. So these were things that we're not currently doing, but we thought would be very compelling ideas that would help advance the field if we were to pursue them. So the first is, how can we concatenate research findings, make them available and make them useful? So the goal here is, could we develop a research data repository that has a secure portal for investigators that would allow us to really understand the scope of the research that is out there and allow investigators to be able to collaborate and learn from each other. And then I think one of the things that I feel like is really missing is a literature review that brings in all of the mechanistic aspects of the disease together in one place and maybe proposes a potential model that might explain how all these pieces could fit together. So the goal here is really, obviously, information sharing, but that it would drive collaboration and hopefully identify a consensus path forward for research. The other big idea that we're looking at is facilitating what we call a bake-off. So could we identify all of the therapeutics that are currently being used for this disease with varying efficacy across various patient populations and fund a series of parallel clinical trials which really rigorously evaluates the top 5. So, the reason, obviously, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and case studies out there. This would really be an approach to try and understand whether they actually work and for which subtypes of patients the drugs work most effectively for. So I'd like to end by just thanking everybody on this call for everything that they do to support the work we're doing in research. I hope it's come across how seriously I take my work in research, and that we've really tried to build a very robust plan that will help us get closer towards understanding this disease and identifying a treatment.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitaker. That was a wonderful summary, and I do hope that everyone appreciates both that we are we're clear and focused on the work that we're doing. Unlike others, we are focused across doing research in many areas of science, immunology, virology, and so forth. And so we're sort of not betting on one horse, if you will, and doing a number of, and funding a number of research projects that will support researchers who are exploring a variety of projects. Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. So next up, as SMCI continues to be the national foundational organization that supports ME/CFS both in the research field and in doing advocacy and engagement work. Next up is Emily Taylor, who's our Director for Advocacy and Engagement.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Actually, just a quick note, Diana, could you mute your line? I think we're getting a little bit of rummaging noises. That would be really helpful. Thank you. And Thank you so much, Sadie. I really have to say it's a joy to work with Dr. Whitaker. It's really fascinating to see how research and advocacy can overlap and how we can leverage our SMCI research family to join us on the advocacy front, which has been an amazing step so far, and I've really enjoyed it. And so I tailored my presentation today to respond to a lot of the questions that I've been getting by email and on Facebook and other places, specifically regarding the termination of CFSAC and what SMCI and the community is doing in response. And also I've gotten a lot of questions about the midterm elections and those results and how they'll affect our ME/CFS policy moving forward. And of course, we're always looking ahead, always moving forward, as Carol said, onward. And we're looking towards the 116th Congress and what our key targets are going to be for the upcoming congressional delegation. So I'll just dive right in, but before I do, I just want to make a note that some of the items that I'm going to share here are through back channel conversations and are confidential. So I'd just like to ask folks that, please don't go posting what I say here on Facebook and Twitter. These are internal conversations about back channel strategy. And so this is not for sharing outside of our immediate community. So from there, I'll just dive right in. So I'll start with the SMCI response to CFSAC and the community as well. So we've definitely been part of a joint effort with many members of the community that have taken action and responded to the very abrupt and I'm trying to find the right word, abrupt and disingenuous termination of CFSAC. The term that the government is using is sunsetting because they sunsetted the charter, but I think termination is the correct word there. So the first item that was done, and this was done led by Mary Dimmick, was a formal request letter sent by former and current CFSAC members. And of course, SMCI was a member of CFSAC for a very long time, and we are very active, as Sadie mentioned, in the working groups. So we signed on in that letter and in multiple capacities. This formal request letter went to HHS formally requesting the reinstatement of the committee. And this is part of a divide and conquer kind of strategy that was cultivated through collaborations with our champions on the Hill. Essentially, this letter followed back channel conversations in which we were told by staffers that there's an opportunity for Congress to take action, but Congress needs to take action in light that HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, rejected a formal request. So that was the formal request letter that was completed and we anticipate the Health and Human Services Department to reject that request. And we're doing that on purpose. We're kind of making those motions on purpose because we can't act congressionally until HHS formally denies a request. So that's the reasoning and the function of that letter. Then I had the wonderful opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C. Last month, just a few weeks ago, and I had a lot of back channel conversations with a lot of staffers, and I'm very excited to say that the CFSAC termination issue has raised a lot of eyebrows, lifted a lot of antennas, perked a lot of ears. Folks on the Hill who traditionally had been pretty lukewarm to cold on ME/CFS, and folks that had traditionally not been very receptive or responsive to our advocacy work have suddenly really paid attention. And so I'll mention our clinical care crisis, I'll mention the medical education crisis, I'll mention many of the other needs of the community. But the instant I mention CFSAC, people pay attention. So I think this is, as some would say, a golden opportunity that this particular federal action has really turned heads. And like I say, the suddenness, the disingenuousness of it brought a lot of attention with folks that traditionally don't pay attention. So I think this is a real great opportunity. And from my meetings on the Hill in October, I feel like we're in a really good position moving forward to take some action with more teeth in Congress. And as a result of that, one of the conversations we had with some of our champions with a strategy session in the House resulted in essentially, as I mentioned, that divide and conquer. So some parts of the community were focusing on the formal request process, and we've been working on this back channel conversation in which our champions essentially said, give us your legislative wish list. Give us all the different things that you wish you could have in legislation, and let's talk. And so we did that and then some. So again, we divided and conquered, and working collaboratively with other folks in the advocacy community, we drafted a letter that was primarily led by SMCI and ME Action, in which I drafted a number of different legislative policy ideas that I've been banking for the past 2 years, waiting for just this opportunity. And ME Action drafted the components that spoke to the importance of CFSAC, the value of CFSAC, and why we need representation that's MECFS specific in government. And we put all that together in a letter that went out just last week, or yeah, was it last week? My time's starting to blur together for me. And we were really proud to say we got 10 different organizations in the MECFS community to sign on to that request. So that's something that, at least in my tenure here, has never happened. And I'm very pleased to see the community coming together and jointly, making a common call for this action. So we have yet to hear response from that back yet, but we're still keeping those channels open. And then lastly, in the Senate and possibly the House, our Senate champions also coordinated a call with HHS and reported back to the community what the conversation was like and what was said. And as a result of those conversations directly with HHS through members of the Senate staff, our champion in the Senate, Senator Markey, is now leading a letter to HHS. So this is still in progress. We'll keep you updated as things continue. But we're very enthusiastic that we think this letter will also, again, really keep the pressure on for future action. So that's kind of all the responses to CFSAC that are in progress and have happened. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions if you have any more afterwards. And so moving forward to, I know, the hot button issue, the midterm elections. Everybody was very excited about that. And again, I'm just going to remind you that some of the information I'm about to share here is a bit confidential. So I think everyone on this call has probably heard that the Democrats took control of the House, and newsflash, spoiler alert, Democrats are now in control of the House. And what does this mean for MECFS? Well, sharing confidentially, during our advocacy day earlier this year in May, we held a reception on Capitol Hill and had the wonderful presence of Representative Gaspar-Larakis, who addressed us, and he's on the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. And we also had a surprise guest that came to talk with us privately, whose name cannot be shared and whose affiliation cannot officially be shared, but they were a representative of the DCCC, the Democratic Committee. And we had a very, very positive conversation. And we were essentially told, again, in confidence, that the Democrats have been watching our issue, they're embracing our issue, and they're rewarding Democrats that are standing out for our issue. So that is huge. So the Democratic control of the House, again, we're a nonpartisan, non-affiliated organization. We're a nonprofit, but we have historically had more support from the Democrats, and Democrats taking control of the House is going to be a game changer for moving forward our agendas and funding issues and others. So that's something that again, please do not repeat that. That is back channel conversations, but happy to share with our supporters here on this call. Key wins and losses. So there's obviously the Democratic support in control of the House is a good thing. A couple of takeaways that are on more of the bad side of what happened with the elections. Because of the transition for partisan control, we are seeing less experienced chairs take control of many of the committees that we need. These are members of Congress who have never been in the majority before, because the Republicans have controlled the House for so long, so they have no experience running a committee. So about 20 to 25% turnover in key committee positions, and that's going to slow progress down. Sometimes experience teaches us how to make the process work better, and we're seeing some folks, Democrats, who are in charge of committees for the first time. So we can expect some transition aches and pains as folks get accustomed to their new roles, and this will slow progress. Also, some key. The other big news that in terms of the midterm elections that we're very, very excited about. One of our largest supporters and champions has been the California Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, and she hop, skipped, and jumped into line, and she is now in control of the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. So not only do we have our biggest champion with retaining a leadership position, but it's a key leadership position, the subcommittee that we absolutely need to get legislation passed. So that is really exciting. We're really excited that that Anna and her staffer Rachel are in such a positive position of control that can then lead to good things for us. And they are hardcore champions. Representative Eshu actually has a very close friend with ME/CFS, and she's been a strong leader in it for us. Key items to watch. I put some kind of little summary here. Democrats will likely prioritize prescription drug pricing, which is Medicare Part D, protecting and strengthening the Affordable Care Act. There's an interesting political dance going on within the Democratic Party where the progressives on the further from the left of center really are pushing Medicare for all. So in order to maintain their base, we're going to see the Democrats kind of pay some lip service to Medicare for all policies, which is obviously going to slow up and clog the wheels of the health committee process. So we might see how that affects us if we genuinely get standalone legislation. We might be sort of held up by some political shadow puppetry about Medicare for all. I do not anticipate Medicare for all programs genuinely getting to the floor, but it definitely is going to lock up our committee process and slow us down. Also, the Democrats are really prioritizing funding for community health centers. This is one of the items that was very controversial and cut in a Republican-controlled House, so I anticipate the Democrats really pushing to get those refunded. A couple of bipartisan issues we'll see bubbling up in the health community. FDA oversight has been a bipartisan issue that we anticipate moving. NIH funding has always had bipartisan support, and we can anticipate additional growth there. 2 graduate medical education programs were unfunded during the last Congress, and they remain unfunded. So we can anticipate some bipartisan collaboration to continue funding for those. And lastly, the Autism Cares Act expires in 2019, so we can anticipate that taking up a lot of committee time, and so with bipartisan support and kind of getting into the pipeline of legislation probably as well. Republicans will likely prioritize repealing and weakening the ACA, which will put them in direct conflict with the Democrats. So we'll see a lot of fireworks for that issue. And of course, the Republicans have really made a strong case around Medicare, the 304B programs on the regulatory side. So we can anticipate a lot of regulation dancing from the agencies regarding that issue. And so those are all different issues that I think are coming up. And when I say Medicare 304, that's what I mean say accessibility. Right? You'll see a lot of regulation being questioned and challenged. So there's a lot going on in the 116th. We hope that we are going to be right in the center of it. And just covering very quickly some of the electoral losses. I know this is kind of everybody's been asking me about. So I'll start in the, let's see, where did I put my slide for the Senate? Oh, here we go. I'll start with the Senate. Claire McCaskill out of Missouri lost. That is a disappointment to us in the ME/CFS community because she had been a soft supporter, like lukewarm supporter, and now we have to start entirely fresh with a brand new Republican senator, Senator Hawley, who will be taking her place, and so we are back to the drawing board in Missouri. The New Mexico Senator Heinrich, who led a lot of action in ME/CFS, has maintained his seat in a very challenging race. So we're excited to have him back to support us. And interestingly, on the Senate side, Marsha Blackburn, who had been a lukewarm supporter in the House, has moved to the Senate in Tennessee. She's I called her a semi-friendly Republican. So we're excited to see. We'll probably continue to put the pressure on her. So we might have a new Republican ME/CFS friendly in the Senate. That is something we've been sorely needing. We have Senator Collins, who's been a steady supporter, but we can always use more Republicans in the Senate, which remains controlled by the Republicans in the recent midterm elections. So that's actually a really good thing. We're excited to see her come back in a different capacity. Turning our attention to the House, I know there's a lot of races still undecided, but I just grabbed a couple that were particularly related to ME/CFS that I wanted to point out. In Arizona, Representative McSally did lose She had been, again, one of those supporters. We had invested some time in trying to court, but had never quite responded to us. We have a new Democrat in that seat, so we'll have to start from the beginning to educate and recruit that Democrat in Arizona. In California, we have a new Democrat, Josh Harder, who is who's replacing the retiring, or no, he's in the California 10th district. Dana Rohrabacher, who's a Republican that we had some relations with, trying to get on board, who had signed a couple of our actions, retired. Daryl Issa retired, and so we're a little sad about the loss of Rohrabacher, but it could be good because the new Democrat in his seat might be more friendly. Daryl Issa also retired, but we're happy about that because he'd always been a big stick in the mud when it came to MECFS. He was very adamant that he would not support individual medical issues. So we're excited that his seat might open to a more MECFS friendly member of Congress. And lastly, Representative Etsy, who had been a strong supporter, retired. So we're very sorry to see her go, and we hope that her replacement will continue to be a strong supporter of MECFS. Moving to Florida, both of our friendly Republicans, Buchanan and Diaz-Balart, held their seats. Our other friendly Republican, Representative Gaspilakis from Florida, he was not up for re-election, so we're excited to see our Florida contingent stay strong. David Young in Iowa, who was a lukewarm friendly Republican, lost to a Democrat, Cindy Axtay. And so we will again be starting from MECFS 101 with a new seat. In Massachusetts, Delaney, who had been a strong supporter, also retired. So that replacement, again, will be starting from scratch with MECFS education. In Minnesota, we had some disappointments. Representative Lewis, who had been a friendly Republican and supporter, was defeated by Angie Craig, a Democrat. Representative Paulson, who was a lukewarm Republican supporter, was also defeated by Dean Phillips, a Democrat. So in Minnesota has swung blue, but we lost the two folks that we had invested a lot of time in who were in key committee positions. So we're going to start from scratch with those folks, trying to get them back on board. One last, or a couple more, going to Nevada, Cahoon, who was a very solid MECFS supporter, a Democrat, retired and was replaced by a new Democrat. So we hope, again, that the new Democrat, Stephen Horsford, will be as big of a supporter as Cahoon was. Cahoon, for those who may remember, led the Nevada delegation letter. So we're disappointed to see him go. New Jersey, I never can pronounce this guy's name. Friglinghausen. He was a friendly Republican to us, and he retired. Was also replaced by a Democrat. And in Pennsylvania, Costello, a very friendly Republican who had taken some actions on our behalf, was also replaced by a Democrat. So we lost some friendlies, but hopefully gained some new ones. But it'll slow us down because we'll need to go back to these new folks and re-court them and get them signed onto our cause. So that's the midterm elections in a nutshell. There's a lot to unpack there. And then lastly, we'll just hit the targets of the 116th Congress with the 30 seconds I have left. I'm sorry, I'm going over time. So as I mentioned before, we really anticipate the sunset or dissolution of CFSAC to drive a legislative fix. We are 100% on board with that strategy, and we are pushing it hard. We do have Plan B, though, in case we don't successfully integrate a replacement for CFSAC into standalone legislation. There is a women's health equity bill that our colleagues and supporters in the Women's Health Equity Coalition are supporting. And one of the key tenets of that bill is interagency collaboration. So we have a backup vehicle if standalone legislation doesn't take off, which we're really hoping it will. We're already starting conversations for Plan B with the Women's Health Equity piece of legislation to slide a CFSAC integrated committee into that piece of legislation. Lastly, funding. We are always fighting for increased funding. We are still pursuing the congressionally directed medical research program. Of course, this is the first year, and I've mentioned this in previous calls, that we anticipate asking for an increase in appropriations dollars for the MECFS line item. We've been kind of playing defense for the last couple of years where we get zeroed out and we fight to get put back in. So we're just fighting so hard to maintain what we have. This year we're fighting to make it bigger. And of course, committee report language, which provides guidance to our agency friends in terms of addressing MECFS. And we're one of the potential ideas that we're floating around is authorizing an NIH ME/CFS program. The idea behind this is that it creates an empty bucket, which may not be appropriated with dollars, but the empty bucket can be filled by NIH discretionary funding. So it's another opportunity to try and siphon NIH dollars into ME/CFS. We'll see if that takes off. And lastly, of course, the Senate resolution, as those of you may have been following this year, it looks like it will not become law, or it will not be passed prior to the end of the year. But we're already keeping plans to reintroduce it in January and hopefully pass it on ME/CFS Awareness Day in May. So that's a large amount of information in a very short time. I'm looking forward to taking your questions, and I hope that gives you an idea of where we stand on congressional advocacy in both the most recent election and the coming years.
Thank you, Emily. My goodness, so much work is being done there. And just a small plug to thank the many of you who donated to us 2 years ago when we first invested in a software system, a very sophisticated system that allows us to track the individual members of Congress and what their views are and what they're voting on, and also allows us to recruit folks in their districts to go to our advocacy days. So that's a foundational tool that we've invested in as an organization, and it's not very sexy, but as you can hear, the results of it are very, very powerful. So thanks to both Sadie and Emily. That's the conclusion of our presentations, and we do have a bit more time for questions. And so do raise your hand, quote unquote, on the system to ask questions. And meanwhile, we've had a couple come in, and Allison Ramler, our Director of Research, is going to take the first couple questions. Allison?
Sure. Thanks, Carol. As you mentioned during the course of the presentation, some of you submitted some really great questions, actually. And so the first from Brigitte, who asked whether or not individuals that live in Belgium, for instance, where we know Brigitte is from, would be able to contribute samples to the U+Me registry. And so just an answer to that particular question, as Sadie kind of discussed in her presentation, we are aiming to make this a global registry. And so in that regard, we're working on sort of the regulatory piece to make sure that we do that all in a way that accords with different standards in different countries for data collection. And we do want to facilitate biosample collection from all individuals because that's such an important, powerful piece of the puzzle. And so that will occur on a longer timeline, but it is certainly something that we are going to drive toward. Additionally, Brigitte asked a bit more about you know, our intention to collaborate with a whole group of stakeholders, including some, you know, other disease organizations that work on ME/CFS. So Sadie, did you want to comment a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think I spoke to this in my presentation, but we absolutely want to collaborate with anybody and everybody. I feel like this is a small community, and we'll really be able to accelerate our progress if we work together.
That's great. So a few more questions from Sura. The first is, will the multiple questionnaires that some individuals that participated in the Solve CFS Biobank from a few years ago be brought into the current registry? So just a little bit of background first, which is a number of years ago at Solve, we set up a biobank and registry system that included a sort of database of questionnaires that individuals would fill out, and some of whom contributed biosamples. And so the answer to that is we still do have that data, and we're working really hard with Genetic Alliance, who runs the peer platform that we'll be using, to develop a really powerful data import tool so that data can be brought over. And so the answer to that is yes, we have that data, and we do have on a longer timeline a plan to integrate that data. And in addition to doing that, the import tool that we want to develop will also allow for a couple of other really important functions that will create a really robust data set. One of those being that in addition to importing, for example, the survey data that we currently have on individuals that will be in the registry, it would allow for researchers that access individuals in the registry and conduct research, research using that survey question data and the biosamples from the U+Me registry to then contribute back their findings into that data pool, creating a lot of data points on all the individuals in the registry. And so that's something that we're really passionate about making actionable as soon as possible. And one more question from Sarah, which is, what about individuals that don't have smartphones? What will we be doing to make sure that they might be able to access these things from a web-based platform?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Chris Armstrong's app is also available on a computer-based interface, so we will be able to complete it through that. We have another couple, they're not really questions, they're comments, but one from Grant Hodgson and one from Janet Flint. Grant's question is about making sure that our education, physician education efforts include CE credits. That's absolutely something that we're going to integrate. So thank you for that suggestion. And then Janet Flint had some suggestions about our repository and including gold standard reports into that resource. I think that's a great idea, Janet, and we've captured your input, and we will have that as part of our plan. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Diana, are there additional questions that the folks on the phone have asked? Diana, can you hear me?
Sorry about that. No additional questions have come through.
All right, I think this is last call. Any questions about research or advocacy?
Question from Christina.
Will you open the line for Christina then? Christina,
please unmute yourself to ask your question.
Christina?
Looks like Christina is unable to unmute herself. Kathy Jones.
Kathy, hi. Could you go ahead with your question? Yes. Kathy?
Okay. Oh.
We can hear you.
Okay. I had a couple questions. One was about research. You know, we've funded a number of Ramsey researchers from countries other than the U.S. And I'm wondering, what are their opportunities for them to apply for follow-up grants?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so obviously every country has both their own government available funding opportunities as well as foundation. So, for example, we know one of our researchers in Germany has the opportunity to apply for a VW, like the Volkswagen. They have a big foundation for research, so they were able to apply for that. And then another one of our researchers, Fane Mensah, who's out of London. There are opportunities within the Wellcome Foundation, and we actually are working with Fane to, we just sent an RFA to him to see if it's something that he can apply for. So the government organizations and the foundations within the individual countries do have funds appropriated for this disease, and we are going to be much more proactive in making sure that people are connected to those funding opportunities.
Okay. Thank you. Could I ask an advocacy question now?
Of course. Go ahead, Kathy.
So I participated in conference calls to the Wyoming Senator Enzi. I'm originally from Wyoming, and I forget the aide's name, Abby Lincoln, maybe? Anyway, he was supportive of the Senate resolution, but he was willing to let us use his name to try and persuade other senators to join that. And I understood Emily talked to this aide when she was in DC and wondered if there was anything else to add to that. And I'm hoping he's still supportive of the Senate resolution when it gets reintroduced.
Oh, well, thank you for your question, and thank you so much for your advocacy. We really appreciate you being part and raising your voice to help convince our members of Congress about taking action As I said before, the resolution for this year is not proceeding. There's been pushback on both sides regarding a date-specific resolution not being passed on the date at which it was relevant to. So as you may recall, that resolution, we introduced it on the same day that we were in Congress on that day when we were doing our advocacy day in May. And then we tried to get additional supporters, but it took some time. And so by the time we felt comfortable moving ahead to pass it, it was already October. And many of the folks who were supporting it did not feel it was appropriate to pass a resolution recognizing ME/CFS Awareness Day in May in October. So we tried some other strategies. We danced around some other approaches. We made some other suggestions, and it was ultimately decided by the sponsoring senator's office that we would not pursue the resolution this year. It would remain introduced but unpassed, and the intention is to reintroduce in January and then pass in May on ME/CFS Awareness Day, which I believe is the week before Mother's Day. So they're going to tie it into Women's Health Week as well. So that's the intention as of now. So while we're really glad that Senator Enzi is still hopefully still supportive, as things remain currently, we will not be pursuing it this year, and we'll be reintroducing next year. So he'll have an opportunity to co-sponsor during the January to May period going through. I actually saw one other question from Janet regarding the ME/CFS Advisory Committee, the replacement for CFSAC, and she asked, instead of calling it an advisory committee, you can call it a task force. Well, so as much as the naming seems irrelevant, it actually does mean a lot in terms of its function within government. An advisory committee falls under what's called FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and requires certain funding restrictions, certain public access restrictions, things of that nature. So federal advisory committees are a specific function of government and have an entire thousands of page document governing their behavior and what their purposes are. And I wasn't planning on going into this in detail, but I'll touch on it briefly. And this goes really into the weeds of legislative language. So for those of you who, if your eyes glaze over, I apologize in advance. But there's different roles and different types of legislative committees that can be created. FACAs, as I mentioned, federal advisory committees, they have different types. There's discretionary committees, which CFSAC formerly was. There's also statutorily created committees that usually accompany a piece of legislation, and their role is to guide the implementation of that legislation. Most federal advisory committees do not last more than 3 to 6 years, and CFSAC was an exception in that it lasted 16. So that's a very odd outlier. It's not a normal for a federal advisory committee to last so long, because they usually have a more narrow description of what they're supposed to be doing. Personally, I think we would have the most success actually getting a specific legislatively created task force similar to the autism task force that eventually resulted in autism legislation. And those task forces, kind of like what the Institute of Medicine report team was, where they were recruited for a specific purpose. And that purpose would be with identified membership from key agencies, identified membership from the community. And my vision for a perfect task force would be to specifically write the needs, appropriation requirements, and programming guidelines for different aspects of what the community of ME/CFS needs. So for example, the task force would be given the task of finding a way to create centers of excellence and write that into a report and present it to Congress. Find a way to create a comprehensive medical education program that can be implemented by government agencies and give that report to Congress. Find a way that research can be coordinated on a federal level and create a research plan that will genuinely find a cure within 10 years with the appropriate funding requirements and give that to Congress. I think a task force with those specific guidelines, with a specific target to give those essentially policy recommendations to Congress, that's sort of the path that a lot of folks have used to get standalone legislation. Ideally, we're going to hop, skip, and a jump over that step and get some this year. But I think the idea of creating another federal advisory committee with a very loose description and a very loose mission that's going to meander along for another 16 years is in the interest of no one. So while we can replace CFSAC and just create it as it had its wins, it had probably more losses than wins, but I think we can do better, and I think the community deserves better.
Thank you so much. Are there, nope, we're not seeing more questions, so I think now really the last call for questions. All right, well, listen, seeing none, we've gone over time a bit. We are so grateful for all of you. We very much appreciate having these conversations with you to bring you up to date on the work we're supporting and to answer your questions. And just as always, your generous support of SMCI makes all of our work possible. None of this could happen without you all, and we are extraordinarily grateful. So we welcome any and all email questions that may come in later, and we will respond to those as well. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining us today.